Let's see. We're live on YouTube. We are just about live on Facebook, I think. There we go. Okay, perfect. That took a
Well,
just
that
a
was seamless.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another virtual event here at the Poison Pen. My name is Patrick. I'm our science fiction, fantasy, and horror selector and reader here at the store. I am very honored to host and interview a debut novelist, Allison Gunn, author of an incredible book called Nowhere, which is probably backwards on your screen, but is phenomenal. Allison, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us and agreeing to do this. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you for having me. This is
Uh,
wonderful.
this is exciting because this is like week two of your debut,
Yeah.
right, as a novelist. So I've got to ask, how's it feeling? Is it feeling a little surreal?
Definitely. Yeah, it is it's beautiful and chaotic and a little scary, but also just incredible. I've had people messaging me from all over the place telling me how much they love the book or like sending me snapshots of where they found the book. Somebody sent me a picture. They had just borrowed it from their library in Wichita, Kansas. And
Nice.
it's just such a cool feeling to know that your debut novel is already in a library where people can pick it up and check it out. It's been wonderful. Overwhelming but wonderful.
Nowhere is blowing up on TikTok as well, which is really very cool. So, the book talk end of TikTok, I mean, you're just sort of exploding and people are really excited about this book and it's such a cool concept. Do you mind giving our readers and listeners here today a little bit of a snapshot of Nowhere?
Absolutely. Yeah. So for me, when I think about Nowhere, it's really a family saga wrapped up inside of the horror and thriller genres. Essentially, it follows the Kennan family. They've recently moved to a small Appalachian town called Dalmouth in Virginia, a very remote part of Virginia. Unfortunately, they've undergone a loss recently regarding their son passes away in a car accident with the father, whose name is Finn, behind the wheel. About a year later, Rachel, the wife and mother in the story, who is also the police chief, finds a dead body in the woods, which kicks off an investigation. Soon after that investigation starts, and she's going full bore into that, children start disappearing from the town into the forest. And that increases more and more and more and more until it sets off sort of a race against time as the Kennans slowly become aware that they are in danger of disappearing altogether along with the town. And slowly people begin turning on each other with the Kennans sort of in the crosshairs of that because they are specifically the outsiders of the town.
Exactly. Rachel's come in from the big city, so is her husband. He doesn't necessarily Finn does not necessarily have all of the attributes that a maybe an Appalachian man, small town. He's not able to change tires. He definitely feels like he is really an outsider within this town. Rachel seems to fit in a little bit more because as the police chief, she sort of has a place within Dolmeth.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. Yeah, Rachel definitely has a purpose for being there. She
Mhm.
has almost not an excuse, but a reason and sort of a role to fulfill. And I do think Fenn, when he arrives, he's a former writer, a former reporter. Um, he's very adrift. He's also, a bit cocky, and because he does come from the DC area. He very much has different ideals than the town to which they moved. So he is most certainly an outsider. They're all outsiders, but Finn in particular, I think, finds some measure of identity in being the outsider, which doesn't help him, to say the
It
least.
really is. And so it sort of puts in this interesting dynamic of this family dealing with this entire, dealing with their loss and then dealing with this thing that is bigger than they are. And
Hmm.
that's what's so fascinating is that you give us a microcosm of how a group would react to this really big event that's happening throughout the novel. and I don't want to spoil any more, but it is such a cool concept in terms of how you've delivered this book, and you really ratchet up the suspense from, from the very beginning, but it just sort of explodes as we're reading through.
It really is a ticking time bomb for sure. The
Yeah.
entire situation. Yeah.
It's sort of interesting because as a book, you usually don't have, within horror novels, I've not read a lot that have a lot of police procedural elements to it.
Mhm.
It's usually, um, but this reads a lot like a mystery genre, a book within the mystery genre, and it fits within the mystery genre really, really well because of the fact that we've got this dead body, we've got a crime that we're trying to figure out, and the fact of the matter is that it may or may not be supernatural, right?
Yeah.
So it's very interesting because at first you do think it's a police procedural, and then it completely sort of changes and morphs a little bit, but you're using the crime and that mystery, uh sorry, my brain is a little mush at the moment.
That's
uh
okay.
that mystery frame to kind of tell the story.
Hmm.
So can you tell us the evolution of Nowhere and where it came and why you decided to do it this way?
Yeah. So one of the things I'll just start out the bat by saying, like, it's been surprising to me actually that it has sort of blown up in the thriller space because as I was writing it, I definitely only thought about it in terms of the horror genre. Not that that was like something I was entirely wedded to, but that's typically how I write. That's the genre in which I write. Um, I'm flattered actually that it has crossed over into thriller territory and everyone has been really enjoying it in that space, it seems. So that's been wonderful. But in terms of how the story sort of started out, how it originated, its birthplace, so to speak, I mean, obviously it incorporates a lot of my background. For anyone who hasn't read my bio yet, I was born in Appalachia. I am the daughter of a now former pastor. We moved around a lot from one tiny southern and/or Appalachian town to the next. In fact, I've moved 25 times. But in any case, that idea of sort of being the perpetual outsider, even though, like Rachel, we had a role to fulfill in that area, that definitely pulled a cord through over into Nowhere. But really, when the story kicked off for me as a writer, it was probably somewhere around 2017, 2018. I was unfortunately in a very toxic relationship, and I write about this in the author's note a little bit, but following a particularly upsetting incident, I ended up getting on the train, and all of a sudden, these thoughts, these ideas for Nowhere just like fell into my head out of nowhere. Ha, see what I did there. And then I immediately started using my notes app on my ancient Android to start writing the story. And for the next few months, that was literally how Nowhere came to life, where it was like, okay, I'm commuting from Alexandria into DC about an hour every day. I'm just going to sit here on the way to, the way back, on my lunch break, just any chance I had. I was writing this story on a notes app until I broke my foot 3 times and had to have surgery. So that landed me on the couch for about 6 weeks, which was wonderful in hindsight because that allowed me to actually sit down, aggregate all of those notes, and format it into the novel that we're talking about tonight.
It's sort of amazing how fortuitous breaking your foot would be, isn't it?
Yeah.
Um, Certainly a painful experience, but a good one because it got you to sit down a little bit and really focus
Yeah.
on the novel.
Mhm.
Um, we're the home bookstore of Diana Gabaldon. She often says that she'll be driving and, a scene will pop up in her head. And it's really common with writers to kind of formulate their ideas while they're doing something else, whether they're commuting or they're doing grocery shopping or something like that. So what do you do when a great idea pops into your head and you're in the middle of maybe you're in the middle of the grocery store and
Mhm.
something happens in nowhere that maybe you want to write down? What do you do in that circumstance?
I love that question. Nobody has asked me that one yet. And that's actually one that that's a topic I've talked about with my friends quite often because it, you're absolutely right. Like those ideas, when you're a writer, they strike at any moment in time. And throughout my life, it's actually been kind of challenging with relationships, both friendships, loved ones, whatever. Because you'll be sitting in the car, even just like listening to your loved one, your partner, whoever talk, and then all of a sudden these worlds sort of come to life in your head. And it's very easy to drift off into those worlds and disengage with everything else that's around you. So I mean, that's wonderful in its own way, and also like kind of threatens to be damaging to a relationship, any relationship. So, what I have found helps is indeed whipping out my phone and either making short notes, or I also carry around with me now perpetually a written journal and planner. So it's kind of all laid out together where I can actually structure the notes and say, okay, on Tuesday, I'm going to work on this. But if a more specific idea comes to mind, I can jot down in the journal portion, like, okay, you got to hit this beat, this beat, this beat. Really, it's just a matter of deciding where to put those notes and keeping them all together so that you can end up transferring them. And then you're not stuck completely in that world while you're trying to interact with others. That being said, I don't think it's a bad thing that writers kind of live that way. I mean, obviously you want to be able to draw the line somewhere. You need to be present for like, your kid's spring concert or what have you. Um, but I kind of think it's delightful to exist in that sort of whimsical space for much of your life. I think that's why writers are the people they are, why we have kind of a sparkle to us and are able to, put such long tales down on the page because we spend so much time existing in those spaces.
As readers, I think we do too, a little bit, because we love to escape into the worlds that writers like you create. And this was such an interesting world because it is so grounded in terms of what you give us. Immediately when you open up the page and you're introduced to the town, it really comes to life and feels very, very real. Having lived in those small towns, do you find it kind of as nightmarish as you portray it here in nowhere?
Um, it very much depends on what small town I'm thinking of. To be honest with you, no two places are the same. I mean, right now I live in a fairly small town, and I absolutely adore it. I currently live in Charlestown, West Virginia. Um, there are some changes here I don't love so much, but generally the town, the way that it is precious to me, and I love my community. However, I can definitely tell you growing up, back when I was a pastor's kid, there were times when it was a nightmare. And very specifically thinking of one particular place in Georgia was absolute hell, where there was nowhere you could go where you didn't feel like you were being watched. And unfortunately, that situation ended pretty poorly for my family, just in general, with my dad and his church at the time. In fact, I feel like so much of the experience in that town influenced Dalmouth, the central town in nowhere, because it was just truly a nightmarish experience where there was a very us and them mentality. So really, in retrospect, I have to be thankful for that, that experience as a child.
I
But I
mean,
would not classify every small town that way. No.
I mean, I moved around an awful lot as a kid. I think we moved around 8 or 9 times, growing up, which isn't, it is not 25 times, which is
That's through
even
my
harder.
life.
And I remember growing up, we moved to a small town in Colorado, Broomfield, which is just outside of Boulder. At the time, it was pretty
Okay.
small. And I've got to say, we lived in a haunted house. I mean,
Oh, you got to explain
disembodied
that.
voices and everything, exactly. And so it was a really weird and kind of dark time. And I really connected with Nowhere because I could kind of feel that sort of something's off, something's not quite there. And I love creepy small towns because of maybe living that experience a little bit and reading about it. I'm like, "Oh, okay, it wasn't so strange growing up and dealing with that." Um, and I felt like, it's such an interesting location that you've chosen, Appalachian, a lot of, your kind of Mothman area, you've got all these wonderful sort of ghost stories, the missing town of Roanoke, um, you know, so you've got no Roanoke was Virginia, wasn't it?
No, so Roanoke, the lost
Okay,
colony of Roanoke, which happened in the late 16th century.
that's right.
Yes, no, sorry, late 1600s. It was actually off the coast of North Carolina. But there is a Roanoke, Virginia, which is
That's right.
named after the same family, right?
Colony.
Um, so yes, yeah, like there is a lot of play between the lost colony of Roanoke in the book and the fact that the town of Dalmouth is near Roanoke, Virginia. But
That's
Roanoke,
nice.
Virginia is a real place. It actually exists. I was born not far from there. I was born in Lynchburg, Virginia.
And it's the South just has so much culture, history, but great ghost stories, kind of that gothic, the Southern Gothic, and you sort of bring that in. And I absolutely love that. Were you always a horror writer, or did you kind of decide later on that that was kind of your calling, the genre that calls you the most?
So what's hilarious is, and if my sister is watching this, I'm not sure if she is, but if my sister is watching this, she'll have to cackle because when I was a very small child, I was absolutely petrified of everything, and part of that had to do with being raised within fundamentalism, like fundamentalist Christianity, because of course we were being told about the rapture constantly, like the rapture was going to happen any day. I used to have nightmares that I'd wake up and my parents were gone, etc. That was terrifying enough. I didn't need to add fuel to that fire. So I mean, when I was writing stories as a little girl, which I think I began doing around 4 or 5 ish, they were actually like little cute mysteries. Like Candy, the private investigator, was like the first character that I started writing little serial small stories about. It wasn't until I was probably about 12 that my sister finally kind of broke through and introduced me to the world of horror. She started out by showing me Scream, and
Hmm.
she was older and far cooler. So the moment she showed me that, I was like, I'm all in. But yeah, from there, it pretty much was like, there was a lot of fantasy, but mostly it had at least a horror edge, if not full blown horror.
That's nice. So Stefania from Italy was curious, and she says, "What scares you the most?"
What scares me the most, I'm tempted to say student loans, but in terms of like uh, sort of your standard tropes within horror, I would say ghost stories are probably my favorite. You would think, coming from like the background that I do, that maybe like possession would be one of the big ones, but actually, there's something special to me about just a good old ghost story where it's like I don't want to know exactly how to defeat the monster. I don't want to know precisely what's happening. I don't necessarily even want there to be an expert. Like I want to wander through this experience with the characters. And every ghost story, the way that you approach the ghost is different. I
Hmm.
love that about ghost stories, is that there's no singular rule. It's not like vampires. It's not, again, possession stories where you got to call in the priest or whatever. Um, it's very specific to the story. So anytime, that I'm looking at a summary of a book and I see that there are ghosts involved, I'm likely to pick it up. Case in point being, I think probably the most masterful horror book I've read in quite some time would be Incidents Around the House with Josh Mallerman. That is one of those stories where it's like every rule that you think is supposed to be followed in the genre is snapped, and you never know which rule applies, which sort of thrill is coming around the corner. I mean, he absolutely tossed it all up in the air, and I think it's a beautiful masterpiece. That doesn't mean I don't appreciate other standard tropes within the genre. I pretty much love everything horror and will watch anything or read anything. But I think ghosts hold that special place in my heart, which is when you said you lived in a haunted house, I was like, tell me more, please.
Oh, we had all sorts of weird things, but like disembodied voices was the big one. I remember being home alone one time. My mom was off getting groceries. I was 10 and I heard her voice calling me from the basement. I'm like, there's no way I'm going down to that basement because I know she isn't here. But it was sort of a weird and creepy sort of experience, and nobody ever lived in that house longer than a year, as it turns out. We found out way later that nobody lasts in that house, and I don't know if it's still there today. It's been, 30 years since we were there, but boy, it was a creepy location. And I love the fact that in your book, the fact of the matter is that we're dealing with something supernatural. And we
Mhm.
might be dealing with ghosts. We might be dealing with a spirit. We don't really know. You'll divulge it later on. But I think that ghosts are some of the scariest things that you can do because they're not necessarily tangible, and you can make them do whatever you want them to do.
Exactly. That's what I was saying with the rules. It's like you kind of get to, as an author, you get to create them, you know? There's less of an expectation that you're going to follow sort of paint by the numbers on in that particular area. Whereas like, I mean, if you're dealing with say a slasher, normally slashers are rooted somewhat in reality, where it's like, well, it's a human behind this most of the time, unless you're talking Freddy Krueger, which again, you can argue about whether or not he's a ghost or what have you. But with ghost stories, with the paranormal, you get to play so much as an author or a creator, and it's amazing. I absolutely love it.
Would you like to have that be your thing as you go through and do, or are you wanting to expand in kind of the horror genres as you write your books? Because I'm curious, will you write would you like to write a slasher novel? Would you like to write, something to do with a monster or have your monster book? Or do you want to kind of keep it with a kind of the ghost and the that sort of supernatural area?
I mean, I can't make any promises because for me, I'm going to write whatever story comes into my mind. I don't really, I'm not a big planner versus plotter. Folks who are writers will know that that's like a huge debate that happens, whether you're somebody who really outlines very neatly and has everything in place before you start writing, or whether you just kind of wing it. I'm somewhere in between those two, but honestly, whatever story fascinates me, whatever comes into my head and I'm like, "Oh, I'm thrilled by this. I'm really excited about this." That's what's going to go on the page. So, it doesn't matter whether that story is, a bunch of ghosts and a house and your mom is calling from downstairs in a disembodied disembodied form,
Right.
or whether it's, I don't know, werewolves howling at the sky in Manhattan. I don't know. Whatever it is, that's going to go down on the page. So I don't necessarily box myself in that way, if that makes sense.
That makes total sense. Um, Stefania was also curious. She wants to know, have you ever experienced any ghosts in real life?
Yes. Well, I say that I'm of the belief that like there are very few things that I know for certain. I can think and speculate things, but I
Mhm.
don't necessarily know many things for certain. So I think that I experienced the unexplained, which might be attributable to ghosts. All of that is to say is that I too, when we moved up to Pennsylvania, moved into what I would have considered a haunted house. I was about, let's see, 13 at the time. Um, and it was a very similar situation to what you were describing, where it was like there were voices that were heard around the house. Sometimes it imitated family members, sometimes it was a completely different voice. You could sometimes stand in the middle of the hallway and it was like there was a radio on somewhere, but you couldn't track down where it was coming from. It seemed to shift around the house. I would hear my parents talking in the next room over, and I'd walk out and they'd be completely asleep. um my room was so creepy. The phone would go off and there'd be nothing but static on the other end, and none of the other phones in the house would be ringing. This shows my age. We still had landlines rather than cell.
Uh-huh.
So plenty of creepy things were happening. um yeah, it was a there are so many things I could go on about that house, but certainly that that experience definitely kicked off a lot of inspiration for me and my stories, and has worked its way into some of the things that I've written.
I can see why. And I think one of my white knuckle reads was the Amityville Horror, where I
Yes.
couldn't put it down till I was done just because I'm like, oh, there's some stuff in here that's like kind of like what we experienced, et cetera, et cetera. So I call it one of my freezer books, to quote Friends, the book that you read and you finish because you have to, and then you put it in the freezer when you're done so it doesn't hurt you.
Yeah.
Um, so how long did it take you to write Nowhere? Once you sat down, was it done within the 6 weeks, or did was it a much longer process than you anticipated?
Um, well, so the when you are traditionally publishing, it is a journey like none other. I don't think there's anything that can prepare you for it. There are going to be so many times when you are editing, making revisions, tweaking your story, and that sounds like, oh, it's a minor thing, you know, changing what door this person walks through in chapter 17. Surely that won't have an effect on the rest of the story, but it does. And so it all changes from there. So it's very hard to answer that question in a way that I think people would find reasonable or concise.
Mhm.
um in terms of writing the first draft, that came very fluidly after I had spent some time putting these like various chapters down on the page, in my notes app, aggregating them all, and then the first edit of it. Yes, that definitely came during that 6 week period of time when I was on the couch. It was beautiful, and I really felt like here's the magic. It's all there. But by the time I actually like grew the courage to start trying to publish, I started out by really connecting with the writing community on the artist formerly known as Twitter, and getting some critique partners, beta readers, and then also a mentor. And through that process, I got a lot of really incredible feedback. Some of it sucked, but a lot of it was good and solid. And so that's when the editing process really began. And it didn't stop until the novel went to, copy edits. That's just kind of the nature and the beauty of traditional publishing, is that it's always evolving. So it is a difficult question to answer, because it's like, well, the first draft didn't take an insane amount of time, but if you're asking about, the actual evolution of the story, then you're talking about, 2018 to, my goodness, 2024. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that's the last time I made an edit. So, yeah.
It's really tough because when you talk about the book, it's usually about a year after you're done with
Yes.
absolutely everything. Because once you,
Yeah.
and then you're like, okay, what did I write? Did I write that? That was
Yeah.
brilliant. Um, but it's always a challenge because a year later when it finally comes out and you're touring and you have to talk about it, it can be a little bit of a distant memory in
Mhm.
terms of talking about the novel and being within it. Um, One of the most interesting portions of this book that I thought of was Rachel, and Rachel is a character because she loves her girls so much. She's dealing with the loss of their 8-year-old son. Um, Her marriage has started to dissolve, or if it hasn't already dissolved, you're not really quite sure at the beginning of the novel. And she's she's you can tell she loves her kids, but she's also very angry.
Mhm.
And I was just curious, I mean, how did you channel that anger of the character? Because you understand where she's coming from. Um, but at the same time, you realize that certain life events have broken her and maybe she's running from them.
Yeah. Yeah. The reception on Rachel has been fascinating to me because there are certain people who very much just viscerally get her, even with her imperfections and her complications, some of the like distasteful things that she has done, they get it. Other people are like, why on earth is she behaving this way? I don't resonate with that at all. And while that is, I think, fairly common for every book, with Rachel, I can understand sort of the mixed reception there. Um, Rachel is very much someone who, when faced with tragedy, when faced with trauma, she goes into this very hardened sort of I will get all of us through mode. And I'll confess, if you ask just about any of my exes who have been with me at any point in time, through any difficulty, that is something that I learned as a trauma response, which was put your head down, get through it, just keep pushing, 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 but don't show your weakness to anybody. And yeah, Rachel sort of has these moments where she spins off the track and has some poor behavior, but for the most part her motivation is like, I'm going to get my family through these nightmares. That is what I am focused on, and it doesn't matter whether people's feelings get hurt in the process. It doesn't matter whether or not my husband likes this. It doesn't matter whether or not, even if her children's emotional needs are completely being, handled properly. For Rachel, it is survival mode. And that's what she locks into. And it has carried her through all the way up until this point. Now, whether or not it helps her through this particular moment within her life is up for debate. But that was really where I was coming from with Rachel, is it definitely is rooted in her own survival instinct. Um, Grief is messy, it's painful. Trauma is it's world shifting, and how each of us respond to those things is completely different. It's unpredictable. And so I do understand how, for some folks, she's a little standoffish. And certainly for a mother, I think people have been very surprised by Rachel as a character, whether or not she's a good mother or not. Um, and I have thoughts about that, which I won't go into right now. I don't always think it's fair the way that Finn is let off the hook for certain things, but Rachel gets cast in a negative light. But I understand sort of the dialogue that's happening there surrounding her perceived coldness in her attempt to survive.
I love the fact that horror is such a great genre to show us at our worst and our best at the
Yeah.
same time.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
it allows
how
your characters to be messy
and
and
I
human.
love that. and 100% human. And I love Rachel for the fact that I would want Rachel in my corner
Me
because
too.
I think we'd be able to, you get through it because by golly, come hell or high water, she's going to make sure, you know, I mean, a little bit to hell with your feelings, and I understand that to get through the situation that you're in because in this point in time, it's life and death. It's, or it's tough. And I'm just curious, is there a little bit of Rachel inside of you? I mean, you're a
Oh,
mother of
yeah.
two. Sounds like you've kicked some butt in your life just reading through your author's note. And you've had the bravery to be authentically you.
Mm. I would actually say yes to Rachel, but also yes to all of my other characters. I think that there is a little piece of me in each and every one of my characters, but particularly my main characters. Um, while I was writing the novel, felt just as close to Rachel as I did to Finn. Which, for those of you who have not read the book, when you do, that might be confusing. You might look at it and go, "Wait a minute, how do these two characters exist in this woman's mind and resonate?" But yeah, I would say, if there was a character that didn't contain a small piece of me, something that I could relate to, I probably wouldn't put them on the page, because in that instance it wouldn't be sincere, it wouldn't be genuine, it wouldn't be coming from a place where I truly understood the character and their motivations. So absolutely, there's so much of me in Rachel, to the point where, especially in both her and Fenn's cases, it's the vulnerable position to be in. And I'm showing more of myself to the world than I ever expected to.
I think that's part of the challenge when you're putting your characters on the page. You are putting yourself in there. You're putting yourself out there, and you've got to be brave enough to say, "Hey, this is, you know, a little bit of me and all its messiness, so to
Yeah.
speak." Um, is writing something that you feel like in a few years you think you'll be able to do full time? Because I'm sure you have a part our full-time job right now, and writing on the side.
Actually, right now, writing is my full-time job.
Nice.
It's been an odd few years for me. I was working with the federal government, and found myself not in a great mental space for that position. So I ended up stepping back from that once I got the deal for Nowhere. Done a lot of side jobs, still doing a lot of side jobs. But really, my heart at the moment is living inside of writing. And I'm fortunate enough that I've been able to kind of piecemeal work and side gigs together to like actually be able to pursue that. Very lucky, very privileged in that sense, because that does not happen for very many people. And I'm not saying it will always be that way, but at least for right now, I'm able to maintain that. So, um, yeah, I mean, the answer to that is I would love to never have to have another side gig unless I wanted to volunteer. But yeah, I hope that this continues for sure.
That's awesome that you've been able to transition from full-time to doing writing. Basically, full-time is your
Yeah,
full-time gig. And
quasi.
that's exciting, because it means that you're really invested in your art and your craft. And I think that that's really incredibly important and very hard to do, especially once you start getting a several book deal. Do you have a book deal after Nowhere now? Are you working on a second?
Well, I'm always working on something. So, I can't even tell you how many novels in my virtual drawer, so to speak. But yeah, I always have something in the work. There are conversations being had, and hopefully I'll have some positive news to share with everyone soon. But as of right
Nice.
now, all I can say is yes, there is always something in the works.
And there's something in there.
Yeah.
Um, one of the um one of our online commenters, I believe it was Robin or Renee. It could have been Stefani. I apologize. Um, asked what is it about a small town that makes it so good for writing a horror novel?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I think that a horror novel can be successful set anywhere. There's something about in big cities where you're surrounded by so very many people that it is almost isolating. So I don't know that a story in a small town, a horror story in a small town, is any better than one that's in anywhere else. It could be in Manhattan or it could be in Dulmouth. Um, but for me, one of the things I really liked about writing a horror story in a small town was that you got to know the characters a little better. When you read Nowhere, you'll notice that there are names, family names in particular, that keep popping up. And if you wanted to really sit there and think through it, you can see where those family lines kind of overlap, who knows who has what backstory, that kind of thing. In particular, I loved working on the Wise family. They have a lot of lore in that town that threads through everything. They are a family that unfortunately is mixed up in a lot of drug dealing and manufacturing. Um, but they are, in and of themselves, such a character within the town, um, and a driving force for the entire story, even though it doesn't necessarily seem that way up front and center. I don't think that would necessarily come through, like the weight of that family would come through in a big city. And I don't think that these little side characters would have the same sort of intimate relationship with the main characters if it was set in a larger place, or even a more remote place, if you want me to be honest. If it was just, some isolated farm in the middle of nowhere, uh, um I don't think that they would be afforded the same opportunity for interactions and those bonds that end up being very painful when they're severed. I think that's where the horror lies when you're talking about small town horror.
It's true, and small towns have the same problems that big cities have, just,
On the micro level.
on the micro level, but
Yep.
in the macro level too. I mean, West Virginia sort of has a bad reputation for some small towns and methamphetamine um, creation and distribution and use,
Mhm.
because that drives a lot of the town economy, oddly enough, or it
It
can.
can. Yeah, it can in certain areas for sure.
And I know right by me is a neighborhood that was known as, at least at one point in time, one of the meth making capitals. And
Mhm.
it was called the Greenway Square because it was just this square within the city and sort of notorious for being known. And you go a little bit further east and you're in a nice part of town. Go
Mhm.
across the street, the other side of the track, so to speak, and
Mhm.
it's that. But it wouldn't make sense, or it'd be much harder for like a cop like Rachel to go in and do the interview when
Mhm.
you're thinking of kind of that big town versus that small town. She can really get in there. She can
Yeah.
ask the tough questions. She can get her hands a little bit messy, a little bit easier. And I love that in the book. It fits so nicely.
Well, there's actually I was flipping back through some pages based on another interview that I had the other day, and stumbled across there was a line in the book where Finn talks about how different Rachel is in a small town versus how she was when she was a homicide detective in Richmond, Virginia,
Mhm.
and talked about, well, in Richmond, she could be standing over a dead body at noon, and by 6 p.m., she'd be home taking the kids out for ice cream. But here in Dalmouth, in this small town, she takes crime personally. she she really like lives with it all the time. And I do think it's because it is a small town, she feels like a very keen sense of responsibility for keeping those people safe. She knows them. She knows their names, their faces, their families. That adds a particular quality to it for Rachel that I don't think she had in the big city.
Absolutely. And this is such a great book, and you've got such a great, clear voice that
Thanks.
it's such a joy to read from beginning to end, despite the fact that, there are parts in this book that I just kind of read kind of white knuckle, making sure everything's. I did skip ahead a little bit and read a little bit at the end just to make sure that, um, everything was a little bit okay. Um,
I have to
because
laugh at that because I've had several people tell me they had to have it spoiled for them in order to finish reading it.
I'm just like, I need to know a little bit more about that. I do that all the time, though. I'm kind of notorious for doing that to myself, just because I get so involved with the characters and I get so involved with the book. But this is a really special book, and I'm so glad to be interviewing you, and I can't wait for more people to read this book.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Absolutely. No, and you've got people from Florida and Illinois and Italy watching tonight. So for those of you online who are watching, wow, thank you so much. Um, Allison, I could chat with you all day. This is such a joy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is
I
wonderful.
I can't wait till you're here for book two.
Me
So
neither.
And thank you for spending your evening with us. And like I said, I hate to cut this short, but we're going to be going live in 15 minutes with Krista Faust. So for those of you online who want to join us for another program, Krista's here in person. Allison, congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate it so
Absolutely.
much.
I can't wait to get this in everybody's hands.
You have a wonderful night.
You too. Take care and take care, everybody online. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Allison, thank you